And I will say
Okay.
too, Manu, that I'm outside, so there might be a little noise around. I hope it won't be distracting, but it's a big day in our house because my older daughter is moving into her Stanford dorm today.
Which
So
dorm?
Stern, I think is what it is. Lucy Stern.
I was in Stern, but where in Stern? Like which?
That's the question. I'll find out for you and let you know. I don't
I'm
know.
hoping it's Larkin because that's the cool one.
Okay.
All of them are cool.
Larkin. Yeah.
Perfect.
Very good.
Let's get started, guys. Let's get started.
Okay. Thank you so much again, Professor Nemerov, for being here today. First, we're going to just introduce ourselves. My name's Zoe Bliss-Kothari. I'm an 18-year-old from Bombay, and I'm a high school senior at UWC Adriatic in Italy. I've been very interested in making and learning about art since I was 3 years old because my mother's an artist. I've always been around like huge canvases and acrylic paint, pretty much. And right now I'm learning about creating and analyzing artwork in the IBTP.
Oh, sorry, I was having some network issues. Hi, my name's Anushka Prakash. I'm a 16-year-old from Calcutta and an incoming junior at Wallam Girls School in Dehradun. Art has always been an integral part of my life and has made me look at the world through a different perspective. I currently study art in school and hope to one day use it to bring a positive change to the world. We're super excited to introduce Professor Alexander Nemerov today. Professor Nemerov is the chair of Stanford's Art and Art History Department. He's also among the most popular professors on campus, and it's our absolute honor to host him here today.
Okay.
My pleasure
So
to be here.
The first question. I saw your Stanford alumni talk titled An Art History Professor's Thoughts on a Painting by Velázquez, where you describe this like switch that happens when you stop looking at an art piece as a painting and rather start looking at it as an experience that can, to quote you, open up worlds for us and tell us ways of being. You also said that art history's role is to take objects like the Velázquez painting and turn them into philosophical objects. I was wondering if you could start us off today with describing how you look at art and art history and maybe guiding us on how we could look at it the same way.
I think the key right away is to pay attention to what moves you or interests you or makes you stop. So a common thing I believe my students feel, and I know I have done over the years, is to feel that we must see everything, going to a museum, for example, everything for a few seconds. And instead, I would say, wander the galleries, find something you know or don't know that intrigues you, and then stop before that. And it could well be that you will not discover an answer to what you're seeking there and then, but that thing will stay with you and will be emerge in your consciousness over time. I know the Velázquez painting for many years was just in one painting among many that I sort of liked, and then it suddenly popped into my mind as meaningful. So when Manu took my course, for example, that painting was not part of the course he took, but now it is. So that's a brief answer, but I think there's one additional thing to say about that, which runs counter to what we might expect when we think of being a good student and changing the world for the better. I think it has to do with surrendering our sense of superiority to that which we study. Everything for young students and for professors too suggests that we must be experts. We must have, in a word, command over everything. And naturally, there is much truth in that. However, the kind of experience I'm talking about requires humility, vulnerability, and a willingness to acknowledge that the work that's more than you do.
Absolutely, thank you.
At his Stanford commencement address, noted filmmaker Ken Burns said that you need science to defend our country. You need science to defend your culture, your civilization. Art, on the other hand, has nothing to do with the actual defense of our country. Art just makes our country worth defending. As we ponder today on the immense value art has in our lives, could you talk about the importance of art in nation building?
Yes, that's such a good question. I have mixed thoughts about that. I get where Ken Burns is coming from, but I want to offer two, if you like, objections to that formulation. One is, I guess, it suggests that science is the thing that is the bedrock, and that art is the ephemeral, mystical vapor that sort of makes the bedrock what it is. And I understand that, but I think that it implies a hierarchy between the two things. I don't myself need to choose between science and art, but art can be so concrete. It can be physical. You can feel it in your bones, and nothing can take that away from you. And that's one point I have. Like, it can be the realest, the most actual thing in the world. And paradoxically, and here I bestow great praise on you both for being able to comprehend what I'm about to say, the actuality of art, of the artistic experience, is demonstrable precisely to the extent that you cannot explain it to even your closest friends or to your family. It just shaped you in that way. But here's another objection, which is, though objection may be too harsh a word, but that seems to me like a presidential or an address that came during the Trump presidency and was therefore determined by former President Trump's noted distaste for science. And I just don't think that's, my political pretty much identical with Ken Burns, I suspect, are not what's at issue in my lectures. When I'm talking about that Velázquez painting, I'm not talking about Donald Trump or anything like that. And I think sometimes the worst moments in my lectures, the least effective ones, are the ones where I kind of, as it were, stoop to the
arts professor of Stanford.
Stoop to the level of addressing the current day. I don't think I'm addressing the current day. I'm addressing what has been and what might be for me and for my students. I'll leave it to the journalists to discuss the present day. And let me just say one last thing, which is that nation building, that question comes up, Anushka, you ask, and I would say, I don't think, though art historically has been about nation building is, is a repressive thing, or can be. And I think I encourage my students to discover a kind of consciousness that's separate from the nations that, in their best sense, allow us to live and prosper.
Thank you for that.
Historically, art made by Black and Brown communities has been constantly invalidated, almost existing in the margins. People have refused to give Black and Brown art forms the respect and stature that they deserve. For example, in India, tribal art forms are ridiculously underpriced in comparison to upper caste art forms. In the US, the Black Lives Matter movement has forced several museums to make their collections more diverse, but how do we make the art world a more equitable space overall?
Yes, that's a great question. I think by teaching art made by Black and Brown people more often than we do, bringing it in your terms, into the commodity structure of art in a more equitable way, though that is a complicated and possibly repressive thing, and one should be careful what one wishes for. But of course, a fair price, an equitable price, equitable opportunity in the money game of the art world, that's all reasonable to think about. I think, like many things, like the teaching of a painting by Michelangelo or by Bellini, or any single thing one does as an art historian, whether you're 18, whether you're 16, whether you're 58 like me, has to do with single steps. What action will you take? And what is the integrity of that action? So if I'm looking at a painting by Giovanni Bellini of the Ecstasy of St. Francis, my allegiance is to trying to describe that picture and make it come alive for itself and for my students. If my goal that day is to teach a photograph by Dina Lawson, a great contemporary Black photographer here in the United States, then I better try to do my best to make that work come alive and to speak in allegiance with its aims. And by such steps, by such single steps, one makes a difference in the world. It's all in the integrity of the action. If it's sort of casually conceived, like today I'm going to learn about, or today I'm going to teach about this, then I think probably nothing moves, nothing changes in the world. But if it's conceived with a kind of rigor and if you like, almost an embarrassing intensity, as though something really matters in this, then I think the world budges, and we can all make these single steps every day.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Wow, that was amazing.
While I'm in boarding school, I use art as a way to connect back to things at home. A while ago, I made a series of paintings on Calcutta where I live, which really made me feel like I was back home. There's something to be said about the power of art in evoking nostalgia. Art almost becomes more powerful the more it interfaces with our day-to-day lives. What role should art play in our daily lives?
Again, I love that question. Well, it's maybe two questions, one about nostalgia, and maybe also incidentally about adolescence and childhood and home, and then another about just our art in our daily lives. I will say this on the second point, Anushka, that I think there's no meeting at Stanford that happens for me as chair or just as a faculty meeting, no meeting, no matter how bureaucratic, that there isn't part of me, maybe 5%, maybe 10%, that is, if you like, elsewhere, that is dreaming. And in that sense, art plays a role in my daily life, which is not, as is commonly held, an escape, but is, I would say, a centering, a grounding, which has to do with the particular fluidity of the imagination and the actual that gives a person direction, navigation, even if it's to get lost rather than found. And I believe, somewhat mystically, that being lost is a means of discovery, of enchantment, and those qualities, discovery, enchantment, I think are very much linked to people your age rather than mine. I feel blessed that I still have some access to this. I can tell you I was on Stanford campus yesterday, just returning some books in the library, and I found it so touching seeing the freshmen on campus and how excited they are. I'm sure Manu remembers this, and just how eager they are to learn and how everything is so brand new. And I was conscious of a little selfishness in my emotion, because I think it was reminding me of speaking of nostalgia, who I was when I was that age. And I'm just, again, grateful that I can still access that even as a middle-aged person. I think home, nostalgia, I don't know. I love the word home because I'm taking my younger daughter on a college trip to Vermont next week to look at schools there, and Vermont is my home. So that's a state in the Northeast United States, just above Massachusetts, and it will never depart from me. It's physical, it's emotional, it's all of those things. And that too is a kind of imaginative actual place and space for me that I can go to at any time. And if you go to a museum and you look at a painting within its frame, or you make a work of art, as you're saying you do, it seems to be separate from life and from all these experiences I'm describing, but it's not. It's a ceremonial centering of everything that's so fluid and almost ungraspable in our daily life. So those are my thoughts on that question.
Thank you for that.
I recently discovered that much of Frida Kahlo's work is largely based on her experience of major health issues after having a debilitating accident. She's known particularly for making art about her experience of chronic pain. And for the past year or so, I've also had experience with chronic pain as the result of an accident. So it was very inspiring to me to see her work and learn about the meaning behind it. And when I spend time looking at her work, I almost feel like this sense of solidarity, because what I'm going through and like what she went through. And it really got me thinking about how I'd never even really known about her background in the area until recently. So, could you tell me about one or two similar historical artists or artworks that you think are powerful in representing specific struggles faced by minority groups across generations?
Yes, chronic pain. I immediately think of the story of Jacob wrestling with the angel, where from Genesis, where Jacob is visited by this, otherworldly being. And at the end of it, he is injured in his hip and he walks with a limp from then on, but he's also greater than who he was. And my own sense of chronic pain, whether physical as you're describing or emotional too, right? The word trauma can encompass many things. Is that it can make us greater than who we were, can make us more, if you like, universal than who we were. It can be a kind of calling to a greater strength by virtue of a trial by fire. And I think, for example, if you think of the scholarship or the philosophy of Black culture and Black art now, and the making of Black art now, I often admire the urgency, the intensity of it, which comes out of systematic injustice and pain more broadly construed than what you're describing with Frida Kahlo. So that's an example of something becoming great by virtue of trial. But I think going back to physical and emotional pain, I think of Emily Dickinson, the poet, and she says at one point, without belief, the behavior is small. And I choose to understand her word belief there in terms of her own, if not pain, then acute sense of separation, isolation from the so-called norms of the world, and that belief and pain and urgency and intensity are all connected. I don't think I could do what I do. I don't think I could get a good evaluation from Manu unless I had experienced a lot of pain. because otherwise I would just be like a walking Wikipedia page or something like that, you know. I would just spout information about things. And I'll say one last thing about this. You know, the kind of experience you're describing for yourself, like it's a very complicated burden because it can make a person feel special and give a person a sense of entitlement about what they've seen, what mountaintops they've climbed to that other people don't know. Other, let's say, more privileged people, more lucky people have not climbed. And there may be some truth to that, but I'm trying to learn over the years not to feel that way, that we all have our pain, right? And I think the key way to access it is to articulate one's own experience in a way that is relatable, as my daughters say, to others. So it's a very beautiful and complicated burden that you describe. And I hope I've given some measure of an answer there.
Absolutely. No, really, thank you so much. I absolutely agree with what you say and what your daughters say, of course. Thank you.
I love the history of social change, and it's fascinating to me how important art is in changing society's impression and understanding of social issues. Whether it's Louis Hines' incredible photos on child labor, which eventually got the US to change their laws on child labor, or in India, where Abanindranath Tagore's Mother India painting revitalized nationalism in the 1940s in the fight against the British. There are countless examples of how art has been used for social impact. What role do you think art will play in our fight against climate change and in our fight for a more fair world?
Yes, well, it's again a very tricky question for me, at least, because art that makes a statement or conveys a message, as you're saying, I would say is not good art. I would say it's something, you know, it's something that's too clear, too simple. And, you know, let's leave it to the politicians and the journalists and the stockbrokers to seek some kind of clarity that is world transformative. I don't think signing up to be an artist or an art historian is the same thing as that. I feel that the artist makes a change in the world by virtue of, again, the integrity of their poetic action and the comfort and kind of profound depth they feel in that comfort of exploring something that has no obvious message or utility in the world. You know, again, to go back to Emily Dickinson, we could scan one of her poems, just a single one, for the entire duration of this Zoom call and be no closer to understanding a single meaning about it than when we began. And yet her poetry is remembered, and the poetry of so many of her contemporaries is now forgotten, even though it was so clear and so rational and so righteous about, for example, the abolition of slavery, you know. So in my view is somewhat like Ralph Waldo Emerson's, that is Emerson, the great American philosopher, you know, that the artist is born into, in his phrase, other politics. You know, Wall Street and Washington, D.C., so in American terms, are not where the artist will be. And the politics are those of a subtler kind of transformation. And I know when I go to Emily Dickinson's grave there in Amherst, Massachusetts, to this day, 135 years after she died, there are little offerings there. And those offerings, which are humble, you know, a vial of nail polish, a little pebble, things of that nature, I think speak to the impact of this person's work on people's lives long after her death. And to me, that's a definition of being an artist. You know, I've just written a book about the forest in America in the 1830s. Is climate change a part of this? I guess so. Do I even mention the phrase climate change at any point? No. That's not my business. My wife might disagree. She's involved in the environmental movement, but fortunately she lets me write what I want to write. Yeah.
Thank you for that. That was really interesting.
I love that. That was poetic. It was beautiful. That's amazing.
I really like what you said also about after so long after Emily Dickinson has died, how her legacy sort of lives on not only in her name, but also how she connects with people. I think that's very interesting. Thank you.
Can I just say something
Um,
about that, Zoe?
Mhm.
Just very briefly. I like to watch concert videos. You know, I grew up in the 1970s and 1980s, so rock bands and things like that with my younger daughter. And I think watching the audience, the response of the audience is always more moving than the music. So it's the response to the poetry that's more moving than the poem itself. But the response could not exist in the world, Zoe, without the art that precipitated it. You know, art is the magnet, and we are, if you like, the little shavings of steel that come to it, right? But without those magnets, we are dispersed, fragmented, in a way, incoherent. So yeah, thank you for letting me add that last part in
Yeah.
response to your very good point.
It pulls us together. Absolutely. Thank you. So in your Aspen Institute talk titled Take from the Rich, Give to the Poor, you spoke about moments of mystic clarity that come to each of us, like your own anecdote from Chico, California. And you also say in that talk that what all your Stanford courses really come down to is presentness and pastness, a rich mixture of the two. And you say almost drinking like an elixir of those two things. Could you tell us a little bit more about that in terms of outlook in and out of the classroom?
Yes, I think that talk, I'm so pleased you mentioned it. I think that talk is very personal, and it does relate to pain, but also coming out of a kind of pain into a kind of beauty and the relationship between the two. I think it's worth noting that that talk was kind of not understood or received there in Aspen. I think because it didn't have a quote unquote message, that whole event, as far as I can tell, was about changing the world tomorrow, even today, you know, or yesterday, if possible. Like, let's all get together and believe that we can instantly make impacts, and that just by talking as reasonable human beings, we can come to some understandings. And of course, there's much truth in that, but the person you've chosen to interview today is certainly not able to contribute very effectively to that. So I remember someone saying to me after that talk, well, how come you called it Take from the Rich, Give to the Poor? Like, I think he thought it was going to be about like social policy, you know, and when in fact, what I was saying, I think, is that we're all rich and we're all poor. On the elixir of past and present, that's a volatile drink, and I'm always trying to get the measure right, and for my students and for myself. But I think the present in this case means something different, Zoe, from the social political present of climate change and racism and things like that. It means being in what is called being in the moment, you know. The palms on Palm Drive at Stanford, the shadows of the leaves of the palms on the sidewalk cast by the noon sun. That's the present. And then the past would be, there once were people who are where you are, or were where you are now, and likewise for me. And how do we respect those invisibilities, or in another word, those ghosts? And how do we try to live with some humility about them and about our own mortality, that yet doesn't make us despair, you know? Pain and trauma are part of living, and sadness, melancholy, nostalgia, what could have been. These are such hard things. And I think my conception of teaching, and I hope to do this better in the future, is that I know my students are concerned with these things, but they are also alienated from them. They are alienated from them because they believe they need to become experts, make money, invent a new app, change the world tomorrow, today, yesterday. And yet I know I can look out and just see that everyone is a human being, and everyone is suffering and is giddy, or both, because of the new person they met, because something is wrong at home, because their friend has been mean to them. All these elemental or primary emotions are just circulating through every classroom that I teach in. And I'm just trying to make the lecture and the art I talk about magnets for those otherwise aimless feelings that my own students regard as, or my own students are alienated from, just as I'm alienated from them often too. We all are in some form of desperation every day. And I can only operate under the premise that it is gladsome, it is lovely, it is deeply meaningful when someone, anyone, it could be me, it could be someone else, happens to speak to those very things, And I'm thinking about the next time I teach this course, which will be next year, I may center it just on these topics like love, belief, memory, dreams, and kind of do away altogether with the idea of focusing on individual artists or things like that. So this is how important I think it is. I think it will always be, in a way, Zoe, unpopular as well as popular, because the world is made of people who demand, and I think that's a fair word, they demand that everyone deliver practical information all the time. And I just can't help that, because when I do that, it's not my best. It's not the best thing I have to give.
Thank you so much. Yeah, about the title of the talk about take from the rich, give to the poor. For me as well, like I read it and it reads as almost being sort of like a trending take on like capitalism, or yes, like you said, social political change. But I really loved that it went deeper than that, and it addressed a different dimension on trauma and like deeper human experience, sort of. So yeah, thank you.
You're someone who talks about how the value in an art piece is in how it makes the viewer pause, feel, and reconnect with their true selves. One might say that the latest craze of NFTs are the very opposite of this. They seem undemocratic, they pander to individual collectors, and appear to be very materialistic, at least on paper. Do you think we can salvage NFTs, and do you think we can find beauty in them?
I think somewhat like my anecdote about listening to music, watching videos, and seeing the audience, the response of the audience, it's all in the response and maybe less in the object. those things are not my cup of tea. There's a HBO documentary called The Price of Everything, in which I am sort of cast as the, the curmudgeon who doesn't like everything that's glittering and valuable and fancy. So you can imagine how I would respond to these new things. What kind of beauty do you have within yourself, I guess is the question, and how much are you able to respond to perhaps an ephemeral moment, an ephemeral encounter, even with one of these things you're describing, that produces a kind of lost, almost foolish wisdom in yourself. And I think also related to that, you use the phrase, find your true self. I think the true self, so-called, is always being invented. And, there's not a true self that exists that then one sort of finds, the ingredients for in order to sustain and nurture it. I think you make it by virtue of what you study, what you, for example, read, what you look at. So following the trends of the contemporary art world, especially as those trends are determined by the market, seems to me putting your soul at risk. I'm not saying that one can't be moved by something that costs vast amounts of money and is perhaps inflated in value. It could very well happen, but I'm just saying you put your soul at risk. I think the path of learning and awareness is much less heroic and grandiose and more solitary and humble. But what I try to tell my students is that, out of that solitude and that humility, as well as that vulnerability that I spoke of earlier, you emerge as the stronger person, and maybe even the strongest person in any room you may be in. And then, as I also tell my students, Manu might remember this, like, it's then up to you what you do with that strength. Because many people, especially at an elite institution like Stanford, can and will use that strength to further social inequality, to basically lord it over others who don't have what they have. They will use even their humility as a kind of weapon. But as I say, and I think I look out at my students at this moment in my lecture, I say, don't do that. Don't be a jerk. So similar to Zoe's point about Frida Kahlo and pain, I think, what you do with your pain, what you do with your humility speaks to your character. And though we're all imperfect, I certainly am, the challenge is to use those things in a humane way, a wise way, a beautiful way. And it's always hard to do that. It's always incredibly lovely to do that. And I could go on, but I'll stop there.
Thank you for that.
That was beautiful. That was absolutely beautiful.
Thank you,
Thank
Manu.
you so much. So when we speak about modern art, a lot of people usually find it confusing and hard to attach deep meanings to. In my own experience, so much of my enjoyment of modern art comes from knowing the story behind it, having known a lot about art my whole life. But to an untrained eye, Mark Rothko's paintings, for example, are simply boxes of color, just shapes. But to me, the story behind his Four Seasons murals and his insistence on having his paintings removed from the restaurant seems fascinating, especially in the current discussion of income inequality. How do we make these stories more accessible to casual viewers so people can have a deep engagement with the artwork more easily?
Yes, thank you. It's funny, the artist I just wrote about was Rothko, and it was the Seagram murals, which are at the Tate Modern now, as you probably know, in London. I think just being in London and walking into that room, which is dedicated by Rothko's ego, that was really it. I will give you my paintings, but they have to all be in one room together, and there can't be any work by any other artist. But to be in that room is to, I think, experience something much more than a set of boxy shapes, but is to experience, whether you know anything about art history or even Rothko himself, a kind of wall of sensation, which is what he wanted. He wanted you to, as he said, I have made a place, I've made a location. I've made, if you like, in my terms, a magnet, And yet, Zoe, I will say that I've always had a hard time with Rothko too, not one of my super favorites. And the essay I wrote actually had to do with one of these moments of chance, which suddenly made the work more vivid than it would have been. And what it was is, when I last visited the Tate, there was a sound coming in from an adjacent gallery. It was a conceptual art piece. It was recorded sounds of the wind. I won't go on to describe that piece, but that sound, which was extraneous to Rothko, was coursing through the Rothko room and was making me see the paintings very differently. And for the first time, I was really moved by them. So sort of sorting all that out, I would say there is, yes, like you're saying, the diligent effort to learn more about the artist, and but there is also the matter of just a kind of pure and irresponsible chance that would never stand up on an AP art history exam or anything like that, but is yet more meaningful. So translated to the social sphere, I would say I would hope that young teachers will be able to tell their students that this serendipity, the serendipity of who they are at that moment, when they see the Rothko paintings, etc., or any work of art that seems elite, difficult, obscure, can be a way in. Yeah, and I think I'll just say one last thing on that, which is something for your generation to solve, not mine, because it's really out of control at this point. It's hugely important, though, is the commodity culture in the United States. I don't know about in India, but in the United States, it has captured all of these kind of feelings already and figured out how to turn them into products and even our very being. So simply put, you be you, hey, I don't know anything about Rothko, but I was having a bad day and I went to see these works and it was so amazing. It was so incredible. Or, I'm concerned that the kind of experience I'm describing, which is priceless and which is extremely personal, Zoe, for example, as Zoe's accident, let's say, it's that personal. You can't put a price on that. You can't turn that into a commodity. And so this is for your generation to figure out, how are you going to safeguard these experiences, which are soft and hard, which are exalted and grounded, which are sensuous and invisible. How are you going to keep those from being priced out of existence, just turned into a kind of glib phenomenon of the market? And let me say this, it's already happened. So the very terms of my question are false. But I will say that when I get up on the stage and give a lecture, I'll tell you one thing, it's not happening on my watch. And it doesn't matter that critics and so on who are more, let's say, to the left of me, mistake what I do as just another form of this commodity culture, like making Stanford students feel better about their already privileged lives. I don't care, because I know I'm not doing that.
Thank you so much. I really like that. I love how you say that like it's fluid and adaptable by experience, which sort of makes it invaluable and not a commodity, like you said. Like most things in art, I guess, not so straightforward, not so binary. But yeah, thank you for that.
In recent times, the definition of art has really evolved. From traditional paintings and sketches, today almost everything in our lives is considered as art. For example, in 2010 at the Museum of Modern Art, Marina Abramovic engaged in an extended performance called The Artist is Present. Over the course of nearly 3 months, for 8 hours a day, she sat in a wooden chair and waited as people sat across her and took turns locking eyes with her. How far do you agree with the notion that everything can be considered as art? And if not, where does the boundary lie?
Well, right. I mean, first of all, that word present is there. And we've talked about presence today and different kinds of presences, right? There's the social political present, and then there's the mystical present. And there's no question that Marina Abramovic is in the latter category. And I, for one, don't doubt the power of her work. But your question, more broadly considered, about is anything art? I think it is a question I get from my Stanford students. You know, there's a great American photographer of the Depression era named Walker Evans. A story I love about him is he was walking down the street in New Haven, Connecticut, which is a grimy, beautiful but grimy, very complicated American city where Yale is. And he would see the garbage in the gutter, just little pieces of paper and cigarette butts and things like that, and just say, every 10 yards walking down the street, he would, and that's just seeing the cigarette butts in the gutter. And so a cynical view could say, well, everything's art, right? Or my kid could do that, maybe, would be another version of this. But as in so many spheres, generosity is the key. And I think, to me, most anything could be art or could achieve the level of an aesthetic experience. I could be more moved by a cigarette butt in the gutter than by the Mona Lisa. I don't deal in then drawing conclusions about that, like what this means. I don't. The world has enough people who deal in quantifications and pronouncements. It doesn't need or want mine, and I'm not delivering them anyway. Or when I do give pronouncements, I think it's my worst moments. But I think at the same time, there is something, Anushka, that you can really say, there is art and there is not art. Next time you go to a museum, for example, a Western museum, look at the frames on the paintings from the Renaissance and the Baroque. Those frames signal the separateness of the art. The art is separate from the coffee shop in the museum, from the bookstore, from the person with the phone taking a picture of it. It's a world unto itself. It's like a meadow or a pond in the middle of a wood. It's separate. And you might say, well, wait a minute. He was just talking about the concert, and the music, the fans are the people who, that's where the emotion is. So the pond, therefore, isn't really the thing. It's the person taking the photograph of the pond who's moved by the pond. that's where the action is. Isn't that consistent with what he was saying? And I would say, well, I get that inference, but no, that's not what I'm saying. No. I think there is such a thing as a thing unto itself that exists without you or me, and whose beauty consists in that apartness, that aloofness even, and that a real kind of power and art of life is to be able to take inside yourself that which is not you, in its apartness, in its otherness from you. Let us cease to constantly demand of the world that we turn it into a version of ourselves, whether in a digital form of an image or in even a more sort of just purely imaginative version of like, oh, that speaks to me. Like maybe it doesn't speak to you. Maybe it is just as cold as the water in that pond and as murky, and yet one is drawn to it. And one never forgets the day that one was walking through the woods and found that pond. And one even smiles as one's friends on hearing the story say, well, I don't get it. I mean, it's just a pond, right? Do you have a photo of it? Did you get a photo? And when you say no, they kind of say, well, I don't understand what you're talking about. You just smile instead of, as I sometimes do, getting all frustrated, you know, because I want the world to have more grace than it does. And I say that again with humility, because I'm just a human being. I'm not, you know, some person who's seen the light or anything like that, but I at least am aware of, and I respect this aloofness of not only the pond, but the work of art that is kind of what the pond stands for in my description, if that makes sense. When you go to a museum, you know, there's something that's 400 years old in front of you that doesn't care whether you're there or not. What you make of that apartness is your own business, but I think there is grace in acknowledging that which is not you.
That was really beautiful. Thank you.
That was magnificent. That was amazing.
It really was. It was incredible. A question from the audience that kind of links to that, actually. Thank you, Paula. That I also find very interesting. Is there such a thing as timeless art, much like there is universal truth? And if so, what makes an art piece timeless?
I don't think there is such a thing as a timeless work of art. I think, but I also appreciate the question and am supportive of it even. I would say this, that, and I'm kind of making this up right now because it is such a profound question, that there is a kind of quality that is outside time in anything, potentially anything, let's say, that a human being has made with integrity and seriousness. Henry David Thoreau, the American transcendental writer, said, a thing done well is a thing done forever. And so let us suppose that there is this kind of quality of the eternal in such a thing. It still needs to be activated by virtue of a glancing, oblique, perhaps accidental encounter with another human being. Perhaps the readiest metaphor that comes to mind, Zoe, is, say, books in the library, where sometimes it chills me when I find a book in the library and I open it to the back and see when it has been checked out, and I discover that the last time it was checked out was in 1953, or some black and white photograph that once upon a time had been used as a bookmark in this book falls out on my lap, showing unknown people, a mother and father and two children, standing in front of an old 1950s sedan or something like that. Those words in that page have been asleep for 75 years, and suddenly they awaken in my eyes, perhaps. And I would say that is a form of eternal time or non-time at that moment, so a work of art might be dormant in the basement of a museum for many years and suddenly brought out. Even then, 99 out of 100 people will pass it by without noticing it, or will take a photograph of it and move on. And then that 100th person, which may be you, not because it's a quote unquote great work of art and not because you are, a smart person, but just through some more mysterious process, pause in front of it. I just try to teach my students that that pause is always a possibility for them and for the works themselves, and that life, certainly education, consists in these pulsations of awakening more than in the steady state, disenchanted stream of knowledge acquisition and self-production that, let's face it, the world demands and expects, not only of you, but of me too, of everyone really, who quote unquote wants to be somebody. I'm not saying don't be somebody, go ahead, be somebody, but there's another game in town that's far more powerful, and it's hidden, and it has to do with I think, yes, per the question, being outside of time sometimes. I think one of the romantic philosophers said, a person in space is a body, a person in time is a soul.
Thank you. Absolutely.
That was incredible. That was
It
amazing.
was beautiful.
Professor Nemerov, I know we are running out of time here. Would you have 5 more minutes for one more question, maybe?
Yes, I do.
Thank you so much. Anushka, go ahead.
So this is a very personal question, but if you could pick 3 pieces of art that are the most personal to you or that you identify most with, what would they be and why do they stand out for you?
Well, I love so many works of art. There are so many dear, almost sentimentally dear ones. I'm reminded again of Zoe's encounter with Frida Kahlo. Like there's something so personal about what is sometimes referred to as one's taste, though I don't like that word taste because it implies elitism and judgments and things like that, but one's sensibility, let's say. I think the painting by Velázquez of the water carrier and the young boy is very moving to me now in my middle age. It's, I feel identified with both the principal figures. I'm clearly the water carrier, but I'm also still the young boy. I remember the Lewis Hine, when I started working on Lewis Hine, so here's another one. And thank you for mentioning his photographs. I'll tell you just a very brief story about at Yale. They were showing me some Lewis Hine photographs in the study room there prior to a class I was teaching, and they were asking the professor, namely me, which ones would I like to have on the walls and so on for my students. And there was one, and I pointed to it and I said, oh, that one for sure. And there was a pause, and the curator said, well, don't you want to see it? And I realized that the photograph was veiled by this protective sheet of translucent paper. And and I thought afterwards, well, that was kind of embarrassing. I mean, I'm an art history professor and they're asking me which images, and I didn't even look at that one really. And I said I wanted it. And I thought, well, why is that? And I can tell you it's the photograph that's on the cover of my book about Lewis Hine with a 12-year-old girl staring intensely out at the camera. And I realized afterwards, it's because every time I look at that photograph, it kills me a little bit. And I didn't want to look at it. It's too painful, too piercing, too beautiful. Who will look at the past and the present simultaneously? Who will look at pain and beauty together? Who will wrestle with the angel at the ford? Who will do that? Probably everyone, except also probably almost no one. And, you know, again, translated back to my teaching, my job is to remind my students that they have that power within them to be shaken and, you know, to be, I think, in a good way, disturbed by what they see, so much that they don't even want to see it, but that in having seen it causes the most wondrous transformation. And then just again, translated to the social, because I know this is of interest to you both. What I tell my students is that that private transformation, which is so private that it's incommunicable, nonetheless causes you to be a different being in the world, therefore causes the world to be different by virtue of your place in it. So this is, I think, the mistake, I will even use that term, that I think a lot of people make about art, whether they are artists themselves or commentators about art, is that they wanted to have a quote unquote message. They wanted to change the world tomorrow, all of that, but the transformation has to happen within. You know, if you want preaching and dogma, just go on Twitter. I mean, that's for that. Like, at its best, my classroom has nothing to do with that. And yet to me, it's an incredibly ethical and social gesture to be thinking about what's between our ears.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that.
Absolutely love that. Thank you so much, Professor, for your insights today. I think I'm a little biased, but this has been easily the most incredible conversation we've ever hosted with the kids. And I am blown away with everything you shared here. Any last words from Zoe, Anushka? Anyone else want to jump in?
I just wanted to say, Professor Nemerov, I'm a computer science major, so one of those people who does things. But listening to you, I honestly felt some of the things you were saying were like poetry. Thank you so much. I was tearing up hearing them, and what it means to open up your mind to this way of looking at art, experiencing everything around us. Thank you so much. It's been incredible.
Thank you. I just want to say that at Stanford, many of my best students are computer scientists. And I think the artistry and poetry, as you yourself are expressing so beautifully now, is there for so many kinds of people. And I think that's a beautiful thing for me to realize too, because from within my little bastion, if you like, where, you know, I could tell you, and the young students may be very interested in this, at Stanford, there are 1,000 computer science majors, and there are 10 art history majors, you know, so within my bastion, there can be a feeling of, well, one feels embattled. One feels like it's kind of like Ken Burns was saying, you know, there's art and there's science and it's this conflict, but it doesn't have to be. And I just find what you say to be very grounding and memorable. So thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Professor Nemerov, for your time today. It means the world to us. And I really, really appreciate everyone joining today. The biggest thanks to Zoe and Anushka for coming up with these questions, for watching hours of videos about Professor Nemerov, reading his books, and killing it, as always. Really proud of you guys. And thank you so much once again, Professor Nemerov, for your time.
Yeah.
It means the world to me. Thank you.
I think it's been both inspiring and just like thought-provoking of my own view of art, especially in like the realm of self-expression, because yeah, definitely thinking about that. Thank you so much for taking the time again. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yes, you're very welcome. And I'm so impressed with you all, and such a pleasure thinking about these very important questions with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Nemerov. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank
All right.
you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.